My Lords, almost 5 months have now passed since Sir Brian Langstaff published the final report of the Infected Blood Inquiry on the 20th of May. I'm grateful for this opportunity to debate the contents of that report, having now had the time to digest the contents of the very comprehensive report in full. I would like to begin by paying tribute to Sir Brian and his team for the dedication and time that went into delivering this crucial report. The inquiry has handled an immensely challenging and sensitive issue with extreme care, and it is as a result of their commitment that the truth has finally been uncovered. I would also like to offer my gratitude to those in the infected blood community who came forward to participate in the inquiry. Their courage in doing so was immense. The government and the nation owe them our utmost thanks. I'd like to thank noble lords who played a prominent role in bringing the work to this point and the important contributions they have made in this House. In particular, the noble Earl, Lord Howe, who through the Victims and Prisoners Act put in place the legislation that provides the necessary legal framework to establish the Infected Blood Compensation Authority and enables the set-up of the Infected Blood Compensation Scheme through regulations. Sir Brian's report laid bare the unforgivable failures of the state and the deep-rooted and long-lasting trauma that has been inflicted upon the victims of this scandal. I'd like to reiterate the unequivocal apology on behalf of this government and governments past. The infected blood scandal is a subject of national shame, and nothing can ever fully right the wrongs done to those impacted. Particularly distressing is the treatment of children who were subject to unethical medical research. Parents entrusted their children to these institutions and were assured that they were safe, only to be betrayed in the most shocking way. I cannot imagine the suffering that these families have endured, and found the descriptions in the section on people's experiences deeply moving. I recognise that an apology also means very little without action, without tangible plans for improvement. I hope that over the course of this debate, I'm able to provide some reassurance to the community and to your lordships that the government has listened, that actions are being taken to ensure that nothing like this will ever happen again. The inquiry's findings are incredibly distressing to read, and I thank Sir Brian for the unflinching honesty with which he delivers them in his report. The report states that what happened would not have happened if safety of the patient had been paramount throughout. This is a consistent theme throughout the report and remains apparent as the scandal evolved and different threats emerged. Patient safety consistently took a backseat to a variety of operational and reputational challenges for the government. Indeed, Sir Brian's report notes that during the emergence of AIDS, the safety of the blood supply should have been the central focus. It should disturb all of us in your Lordship's House that this was not the case. My Lords, the conclusions in the report of a cover-up driven by those in positions of power is sobering for us all. Individuals put their own self-interest before the safety of those they were supposed to serve. Sir Brian's findings on the government action and what he describes as a defensive culture that led to many of the decisions that precipitated this scandal are important to discuss. Indeed, Sir Brian highlights the consequences of civil servants and ministers adopting lines to take without sufficient reflection, when they were inaccurate, partial when they should have been qualified, had no proper evidential foundation, and made unrealistic claims that treatment had been the best it could be. A crucial example of this is the use of the phrase, "no conclusive proof." In Volume 1 of the inquiry, we read that the first use of no conclusive proof appears in a line to take drafted for the then Prime Minister in 1983. And I quote, "It is important to put this in perspective. There is as yet no conclusive proof that AIDS has been transmitted from American blood products," end quote. The accompanying briefing note included the sentence, "As yet there is no conclusive proof that AIDS is transmitted by blood as well as by homosexual contact, but the evidence is suggestive that this is likely to be the case." Throughout the period of increased parliamentary and media scrutiny in 1983 and 4, this caveat was omitted. As Sir Brian states in his report, this line to take, while technically correct, was indefensible. It did not spell out the real risk. It gave false reassurance, it lacked candour, and by not telling the whole truth was misleading. No minister challenged the no conclusive proof line. His words paint a disturbing picture. A government and a state more worried about the abundance of the blood supply than the safety of the blood supply. My lords, there is a wealth of evidence that Sir Brian has uncovered that points to the same thing. A state more focused on protecting itself than protecting its people. This is utterly unacceptable. I'll move on to discussing Sir Brian's recommendations and the progress we have made, but I want to stress that in doing so, I do not want to minimise in any way the report's findings. It's impossible to find the words that capture the severity and gravity of what is described in the report. It is incumbent upon all of us to do what we can to provide justice to those impacted and ensure that no such disaster, no such scandal can ever be allowed to occur again. I turn now to the 12 recommendations the inquiry makes in its report. The recommendations are wide-ranging and are still being given full consideration by the government, and the Minister for the Cabinet Office will update Parliament on the progress made on considering and implementing each of the recommendations by the end of the year. I'll briefly touch on some of the recommendations now, but I know noble lords will draw out others within the debate. Firstly, on compensation, progress is being made. Over £1 billion has already been paid out in interim compensation, and the government will pay out interim payments of £100,000 to estates of deceased people who were infected with contaminated blood or blood products and have not yet been recognised. This reflects the agreement reached in this House under the Victims and Prisoners Act, and I pay tribute to the many noble lords who supported this important work and continue to be advocates for the infected blood community. I'm also pleased that on 23rd of August, the government laid the necessary legislation to enable the Infected Blood Compensation Authority to begin making payments to people who are infected, both living and deceased. The government expects the Infected Blood Compensation Authority to begin payments under these regulations by the end of this year, and the authority is doing everything possible to be fully ready to deliver payments to as many as possible as soon as possible. Further regulations will be required for people who are affected. However, this will not impact the government's intention for the Infected Blood Compensation Authority to start making payments to people who are affected in 2025. This progress came following a considerable engagement exercise undertaken by Sir Robert Francis KC, Interim Chair of the Infected Blood Compensation Authority in June this year, with members of the infected blood community. In August, Sir Robert's report was published alongside a final report from the Infected Blood Inquiry Response Expert Group and a detailed policy document from the Cabinet Office setting out the design of the scheme, including case studies with examples of how this would work in practice. Secondly, on patient safety, the government is prioritising patient safety to ensure that the NHS treats people with the high quality and safe care that they deserve. Repeated inquiries and investigations have highlighted significant issues with patient safety, and this has contributed to deterioration in public confidence. This is something we must address. The Secretary of State for Health has already been clear that we will not tolerate NHS whistleblowers being silenced. A culture of openness and honesty is vital for ensuring patient safety. We want and need NHS staff to have the confidence to speak out and come forward if they have concerns. I'm pleased to say that on recommendation 5, ending the defensive culture in the civil service and government, work is underway across government to ensure we reflect fully on Sir Brian's words. In the King's speech opening this Parliament, the government set out its commitment to bringing forward legislation to introduce a duty of candour for public authorities and public servants. The Prime Minister confirmed at the Labour Party conference that legislation on a duty of candour will be delivered by this government. He confirmed that this duty will apply to public authorities and public servants and will include criminal sanctions. Work continues on the scope of the bill. I know colleagues across this House will have strong views on this, and I welcome the opportunity to come together and debate the government's proposals when the bill is introduced. The 12th and final of Sir Brian's recommendations relates to giving effect to the recommendations of his report. I acknowledge the criticism that is made both by parliamentarians and others on the failure of governments to give proper regard to the recommendations of previous statutory inquiries. The government is determined to ensure that no such criticism can be levelled against the response to Sir Brian's report. I'm aware that the updates provided on progress in my statement are by no means exhaustive, nor cover the full breadth of the recommendations laid out by the inquiry. As I've said, my right honourable friend, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, will set out in more detail the government's response to the recommendations in a statement in the other place by the end of the year. Finally, I'd like to thank Noble Lords for their understanding and the need for quick progress on the first set of regulations made possible via the made affirmative procedure. In order to remain in force, the regulations must be debated and approved by Parliament by the 23rd of October, and I look forward to discussing this important matter further. As I'm sure all Noble Lords can agree, it is critical that the Infected Blood Compensation Authority retains the legal powers needed to begin making payments as soon as possible, enabled by these regulations. I'm aware of the interest this topic holds across the House, and I'll hold a drop-in session for all Noble Lords who may have specific questions on the government's progress. My Noble Lords, let us be in no doubt of the importance of the findings of this report. I'd like to reiterate my thanks once again to Brian and his team, and to all those who came forward to share their stories, no matter how painful. The report lays bare the failure of the British state and the institutions in which people place their trust, in institutions in which we ask people to place their trust as well. That failure leaves an indelible stain upon our nation, a mark of shame upon each and every person that allowed it to be perpetuated. There's nothing I can do or that we can say that will right the wrongs done to those infected and affected by this scandal. The best that we can do is to read, to reflect, and to honour the courage of those impacted by this scandal and take the necessary action to ensure that something of this nature is never allowed to happen again in our country.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My Lords, on an earlier occasion, I took the opportunity to ask a question or a couple of questions in relation to the statement, and at that time I also took that opportunity just after the report had been published to reiterate what was the apology and the expression of deep regret which I gave to the other place on the 10th of January 2011. What of course in the intervening months has been possible is to read much more of the report. Indeed, as the noble lady, the Minister, said in an extremely helpful introduction to this debate, to read some of the people's experiences in Volume 2. And I think it makes one feel very, very strongly the sense of injustice and of trauma and of suffering that so many families will have experienced. From my point of view, I cannot possibly deal with all of the issues in the report. I want to focus on just one or two that are matters of my personal experience, where of course I was Secretary of State in 2010-11 when we made a further review of the Skipton Fund and made what we regarded and understood at the time to be very significant additions to the hardship payments and support offering to the sufferers and their families. But I also want to just raise a question, because I think looking at the issues as we've done since the report was published, it does beg a very serious question about the culture inside government and the culture inside the civil service, which the Minister rightly referred to in Recommendation 5, and I want to talk briefly about those. But the first thing I want to do is just to revert back, if I may, to that time when in 2010, of course, if a number of noble lords here will recall, I note that by my estimation, there are at least 16 members of your Lordship's House who held ministerial office and were responsible in one form or another for the decisions that were made in relation to these issues. 16 members now, and there are probably more. I've probably forgotten one or two. But from my point of view, back then in 2010, of course, many noble lords will recall that their Lord Archer of Sandwell had undertaken his inquiry. We came into office as a coalition with the intention, we had expressed in opposition our view that the government should have been more transparent and open with the Archer inquiry. But that in any case, we had a responsibility then to respond to it. Indeed, because of a successful judicial review of the previous government's decision, we had to renew a decision in relation to the question of compensation, where the Archer inquiry had recommended that we should issue compensation comparable to that which had been provided in Ireland, which again we reviewed that decision and we decided not to do that. At that time, we did, however, significantly increase the compensation. My noble friend Earl Howe on the front bench actually will have repeated that statement in this House and will recall the very widespread support that was given for what represented somewhere up to £130 million of additional support during the course of that Parliament. Anne Milton was my minister in the ministerial team at that time who undertook that review of the Skipton Fund and in opposition and in government had engaged very widely with the community and the beneficiaries of the Skipton Fund. She had spoken to very many of them. I just want to say, of course, Anne Milton is now no longer in the other place. She's not here. She doesn't have a place where she can speak to these issues. But I would just say to for those who are reading the inquiry, when one looks at volume 6, which looks at the government response to many of these events, and in particular, there is toward the end of that section relating to the decisions that we made at that time. There is the following sentence expressing the view of the inquiry, where it says, "What is most disappointing about the response to the Archer inquiry is the sense it leaves that government was looking to see what was the least that was required of it." I have to say, that was absolutely not my experience, nor that of others at the time in relation to the work that was being done by ministers at that time. It certainly wasn't the view of Dawn Primarolo at that time in the previous administration. I know that to be a fact. It certainly was not the view of Anne Milton. She was looking to do the most that we could do by way of adding to the hardship payments and the support that we could at that time in what noble lords will recall were very difficult financial circumstances. At the time, in the other place and here, it was very widely welcomed that we had done so. So I do hope that we will not misconstrue people's intentions. We got things wrong and we didn't know, and arguably we were given inaccurate advice, particularly in relation to the question of there having been no finding of fault and what lay behind that. And we are open to the accusation that we did not challenge it sufficiently. But I don't think we were ever looking to do the least that we could get away with. We were absolutely trying to achieve the most that we could for the sufferers and their families. Second thing I might say in passing, at that moment, all ministers pretty much at any moment seem to have been accused of not having instituted a public inquiry. I think there may have been other occasions when a public inquiry would have made sense, but trying to do so in 2010 in the immediate wake of the Archer inquiry probably made no sense. I think it would be good for inquiries when they seek to look with the benefit of hindsight actually to try and put themselves in the position of those who are making decisions at that time. It would not have made any sense, in my view, to have instituted a public inquiry in circumstances when nobody was asking for one. And we had just had the Archer inquiry, and everybody was focused on our response to that. So the issue, from my point of view, simply in that sense did not arise. So just one more point I want to make, which I think is in any case the most important. Reading earlier sections of which I was unaware, noble lords will be aware of the frequency with which ministers were to say that at every stage the government has acted as swiftly as possible, or in the line to take, which was repeated many times over many years, that the best available treatment had been provided in the light of medical knowledge at the time. Whereas we now discover through the inquiry report an official inside the Treasury saying to the private office of the Chief Secretary at the time, quote, "I understand from the Department of Health that there are more than 500 sufferers," that is, roughly speaking, half the total community at that time, "who might in principle have contracted the virus after the stage at which hospitals might reasonably have been expected to use different forms of treatment." And I think that links to the broader question of the stage at which it would have been possible to have secured greater self-sufficiency in the availability of blood products and to have found alternative forms of treatment at earlier stages and to have understood the nature of the risks. And indeed, for that matter, I might add, properly informing patients of the risks, which we now discover was not done, and there's no evidence that it was done, even though it was asserted that it was done. So I come back to this question. We were very often in the position where we were trying to make a decision where we were given what was essentially two options. One, we acknowledge fault, or alternatively, we say that there was no fault finding and that therefore compensation should not be available. The noble Lord Reid is not now in his place, but if he were here, I would have particularly said I thought he, in 2003, quite rightly, and with the benefit of hindsight, took a very courageous decision to say that isn't what it's about. What it's about is our moral responsibility. And that there is a space, there is an important space between fault on the one hand or no fault on the other. And that is where you have a responsibility for where harm occurs. And the government has a duty of care, which indeed I think this arose in the course of the litigation back in 1989 rather, and 1990, that the government had a duty of care and will have breached that duty of care. So I think what we need to do is to think in the government's response to this inquiry whether we need to find a way in which we find a middle way between, on the one hand, no fault compensation, and on the other, restricting ourselves only to providing support and compensation in circumstances where fault has been found according to a test which parallels clinical negligence. The government has responsibilities and a duty of care that is not limited to the best available treatment according to medical knowledge at that time in relation to that clinician. It has a wider responsibility, and I think we need to find a more systematic way of understanding that wider responsibility and fixing that place half that is between these two extremes, because the feeling that ministers were always advised that they had to choose between either a test comparable to clinical negligence on the one hand or purely ex gratia payments on the other did not properly recognise the duty of care that ministers and the government had to exercise in relation to those who had suffered as a result of the failures in treatment.
Lords, I thank the noble lady, the Minister, for her repeat of the statement. And in my contribution in this debate, I want to really talk about the affected rather than the infected. Though listening to the noble Lord Lansley, he sparked something in my memory when I believe I came to him to talk about this. But I have to go back, I had forgotten that entirely, but I need to go back to my notes of that to find out, because I know I felt very disappointed after I came to you that day. And I can't remember why exactly or what you said, so I will go back to my notes. Anyway, as I said, I want to talk in my contribution about the affected, and the distinction between those who are infected and those who are affected, such as family members and caregivers, raises important ethical considerations regarding compensation. And while pecuniary support addresses financial burdens, it doesn't really touch the broader impacts on affected individuals. And today I am seeking assurance on how the compensation is going to be assessed for the affected. And sadly, as I've done each time I speak on these matters regarding the contaminated blood scandal, I have to declare an interest because my nephew, one of my sister's twin boys, was a haemophiliac, was infected with hepatitis C, was exposed to CJD and died aged 35, leaving his partner and a baby daughter of 10 months old. So I want to speak about the affected, the eligible persons, and I'd like the Minister to clarify and confirm, if she can, on the record, that the affected will be compensated in the way Sir Brian Langstaff has made clear that should be the case, and as he did it in the inquiry's conclusions. And I have to say I'm indebted to the Hepatitis Trust. I don't know if anyone else in this chamber saw the webinar they produced on the government's work on its websites, and they're to be congratulated with how open it is and how well publicised it is. But it was a masterclass in what is quite a complicated compensation scheme to follow. But I'm sure the Minister would agree that it would be unforgivable at this stage, unconscionable, when families and victims have fought for decades to get the inquiry and were so relieved by its findings, if there were to be any retrenchment or any effort to reduce a financial obligation by sidelining the affected. Sir Brian seemed concerned that this might be the case when he said of the government's offer and direction of travel for the affected that a claim as a dependent focuses instead not on the personal losses of the affected person, nor upon whether they have suffered emotionally, but upon the benefits the deceased would personally have provided in money or money's worth to the claimant as part of the family, and that a dependence claim is a derivative claim rather than one which recognises the person as an individual. So, if possible, can the Minister clarify that Sir Brian is right or not right in his concern about a dependence claim as described? Families of the infected did not necessarily have any financial support from their deceased loved one or living victim, but their lives were fundamentally affected by the support that was needed over many years and throughout their lives and prior to death, and the support needed after death by siblings and parents and children. And the loss was never, ever just financial. I saw, obviously personally, not just the emotional toll on my sister and her husband, outside of the fight that she carried on for decades to get the inquiry, to get justice, because we, when I speak of the community, all knew that there was a disgraceful cover-up. And I fear that some in the government did too, as did the civil service. And I cannot begin to describe the burdens and the trauma and the emotional toll and the fear, let alone the accommodations and the challenges and the costs of having a child who was not only a spontaneous haemophiliac, but as I said, was infected with Hep C and exposed to CJD. And when he was told that he had been exposed to CJD, just an example of how terrible everything was, he was an older child at that point, and he was told that he'd been exposed to CJD. There was no warning that he would be told that. His parents were not there. No one was invited to support him. There was no support given for what at that point was a terrifying, really terrifying prospect. And because of the Hep C, he had to go through the most dreadful of treatments. I mean, now, thank goodness, there is a route for medical treatment of Hep C. But then the treatments that were in play made him sick for months on end, totally disabling him from being able to work for long periods while he battled the Hep C. And the health service kept putting him on new treatments to try to cure the hep C, and the last treatment he tried failed. They all failed. And it was the hep C and its treatment that killed him. It wasn't being a haemophiliac that killed him. And my sister and her husband, Nick's parents, spent his life supporting him, getting him to and from hospital all the time, looking after him when necessary, soothing him in his distress and his pain and his fear. He was a musician, a guitarist, a brilliant songwriter and a singer in several bands. And as I said, he left a partner and a 10-month-old baby girl. And my sister and brother-in-law had to support her and the baby, not just financially, but for many years. As a partner, thankfully, the government seems to recognise the loss of a partner, and she has now received the interim payment. But of course, nothing can replace a partner and the loss of her daughter's father. But Nick had a twin, and the twin's life and my sister and brother-in-law's lives have, as so many families in this community, have been woven around supporting Nick when alive. And Neve, who was a 10-month-old baby, is now a lovely young girl of 12. Never know her father. These are the affected materially, emotionally, in terms of time, of loss of their right to a family life, everything. So I hope I'm wrong and that the government is heeding all of Sir Brian's recommendations, because the government forced families to provide care both in time, finance and emotional hell by failing over decades to take responsibility for its malpractice, lies, deceit and cover-up. And hundreds of absolutely useless meetings over decades where the infected and the affected were made to feel like supplicants and treated rudely and carelessly and fobbed off over and over again as if the government couldn't wait to get rid of them. And it would simply be another blow, another pushing away of responsibility to ignore Sir Brian if the government were to proceed with setting levels of compensation only on dependents and derivatively. So yes, obviously, if there was an actual pecuniary loss because Nick supported his parents, yes, but it was nothing to do with that. He never supported his parents. He could barely work. That isn't the point Sir Brian was making. This is about the costs in time and money and tears and loss, and post his death, to support the support that had to be given to his partner and baby daughter. Nothing to do with any money he might have been able to give them. So can the Minister put on the record that compensation will include consideration of all losses, emotional damage, and the loss of the right to a family life by those who cared for their infected loved ones, the hours of care, the support given, the fight to try and get Nick cured of hep C, the terrible experimental treatments that tortured his body and his psyche, the worry, the heartbreak and the time. It is the least that they can do. And pronouncing a duty of candour going forward is great, but it isn't going to help the loved ones of those who care or who have cared for those infected. I wonder whether the government has any idea what an amazing day it was when Theresa May announced that she had commissioned an inquiry after the decades of lies and obfuscation. It was an amazing change after decades of begging, and how miraculous it was to have such a chair of the inquiry, the extraordinary, the just, and the brilliant Sir Brian Langstaff. And the findings of the inquiry gave the community at last a sense of justice, both in the uncovering of the truth and the compensation for the pain and the fights and the consequences of the hideous scandal of giving haemophiliacs and others contaminated blood, knowing about it and covering it up. Covering it up. In France, ministers went to prison. May I ask the Minister whether the government is looking at all at whether any criminal charges may be brought? There is much good work and much good planning going on, and I congratulate the government so far on what it is doing to deliver the compensation schemes, particularly for the infected and their estates if they have passed on, and for their partners. But it is less clear, as not developed, as the noble lady, the Minister, said thus far, in terms of the affected. And their compensation must, as Sir Brian indicated, encompass the emotional and psychological impact, the time in caregiving, the loss of quality of life, the anxiety, the hell of watching, the torment and the pain, the need to recognise the suffering of those who love the infected, the loss of the right to a family life, and the years of worry and grief. I beg the government, do not fall at that last hurdle, do not penny pinch, do not obfuscate or wriggle out of true obligation. This really is the moment of reckoning.
My Lords, it's difficult to follow those personal recollections, but I think they bring home to us the suffering that so many people have experienced. I should, in the spirit of openness, say that I chaired the inquiry's expert advisory group on public health and public administration, and in that capacity I gave evidence to the inquiry. And with that experience, although it's been said already, I want to add my tribute to the way in which Sir Brian Langstaff chaired this inquiry. I've chaired a public inquiry myself, much smaller. I know how difficult that was. I think he's achieved almost the impossible, a report which is forthright, which is clear, succinct, and as the noble lady, the Minister, said, unflinchingly honest. But the thing that impressed me most of all was the relationship which he had managed to build with the victims, their families and supporters, which I think was really quite remarkable. Sadly, of course, the performance of the inquiry contrasts sharply with the failings which it has exposed. And whilst I am, of course, desperate to see the victims finally receive justice and compensation, I want today to focus on the need for us to follow up the inquiry by responding to the failings themselves, which represent for me a breakdown in public service standards, which have been evident in too many cases in the recent past, in the Post Office, in Grenfell, Windrush and Hillsborough. And I don't think these can any longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. There's a pattern, and the pattern besmirches the public service that we have known and many of us have worked in for the whole of our lives. The tragedy of infected blood claimed 3,000 lives. But I sometimes still feel that the world finds that horror so difficult to comprehend that we're not giving enough attention to how it happened. As Sir Brian makes clear, this could have been avoided. That's the greatest tragedy of all. It could have been avoided if the state had behaved in the way in which the various codes of behaviour suggested that it should. But it did. And instead, and painful though it is to relate, I think it's important to do so, instead it falsely reassured the public and patients. It failed to tell people of the risks of treatment. It deliberately destroyed documents. It failed to tell people they were infected. It offered no meaningful apology or redress. It repeatedly used inaccurate, misleading and defensive lines to take. And finally, it responded to calls for a public inquiry by producing flawed, incomplete and unfair internal reports. The point is that these were not unfortunate mistakes. In some cases, they were deliberate. In too many cases, they were deliberate attempts to mislead and to obfuscate. Deliberate attempts to protect the institutions of the state to the detriment of individual citizens. And as Sir Brian says, it will be astonishing to anyone who reads this report that these events could have happened in the UK. Astonishing, I would add, because we have long proclaimed so proudly in the Nolan Principles, the Civil Service Code, the Ministerial Code, our commitment to openness, to integrity, to honesty, to fairness, all of which were so obviously absent in the many years during which the infected blood tragedy unfolded. The only conclusion I can draw is that the arrangements that we currently have in place to set and enforce the standards that we expect from public officials are inadequate. They're insufficient. They need to be revisited. The only question for me is, what exactly are we now going to do about it? The inquiry report itself raises the possibility of a new duty of candour, which I've long supported. Rather more important, the Prime Minister, it seems, supports that and recently announced, as the noble lady the Minister said, that a bill would be introduced in April next year to place that duty on the statute book. That bill has become known actually as the Hillsborough Law. But I see it as just as important a part of the response to the infected blood inquiry. And I would suggest actually it's a mistake to link it to just one of the many recent tragedies. The promised bill will represent a step forward, but there are many questions that we need to ask. And I'd like to pose some of them today, and I know the noble lady, the Minister, is not going to be able to answer them, so I hope she'll pass some of them on maybe to her Cabinet Office colleagues. The first question I have to ask is, why is it taking so long to publish a draft of a bill which is central to the way in which the state relates to its citizens, and therefore central to the way in which this new administration intends to govern? I know how difficult it is to produce and draft a bill. I know how difficult it is to produce white papers. I have to say, I'm still surprised that it will have taken a year since the publication of the inquiry report to the publication of a bill. The second question I ask is whether it's going to be broad enough in scope to give statutory force to the behaviours which are currently set out in the Nolan Principles and the various codes? Or will the new duty only apply to occasions when officials give evidence to inquiries, give evidence in court cases, or to judicial review requests? If that is what it's about, then it will fail to introduce accountability for the failings which do not become the subject of such formal scrutiny, but which can still bring untold suffering to ordinary citizens. Will the bill be the subject of extensive pre-legislative scrutiny involving relevant campaign groups and ordinary members of the public? This is about redefining, as I said, the relationship between the state and individual citizens. We need to find a way of ensuring that individual citizens have a chance to be involved. And will the new bill make clear that the ultimate responsibility of any public official is not to the institution they work for, it's not even to ministers, it is to members of the public. Until these and other questions are answered, we can't be sure that the failings that Sir Brian identified will be effectively addressed. And I'm afraid people are really quite sceptical, given the experience that we've heard, that many have suffered from down the years. What we do know today is that the inquiry report tells us that all is not well in the way in which the state and our public officials behave. It tells us that we've sometimes, I'm afraid, been too complacent about our standards in government in the UK. And it reminds us that decent, ordinary, but ultimately powerless people can have their lives and the lives of their loved ones devastated by government and its agencies. Excuse me. If anything positive is to come out of this disaster, it should be this redefinition of the relationship between the state and individual citizens. And the quicker we get to the crux of that, the better.
My Lords, I am grateful to the noble lady, the Minister, for ensuring this vital debate has been scheduled and for this opportunity to contribute to it. I share with other Lords in expressing gratitude to Sir Brian for his comprehensive report and in expressing deep sorrow at the distress suffered by the infected and affected alike, in many cases ongoing. I simply want to touch very briefly this afternoon on three particular matters: candour, culture and compensation. First, the duty of candour. As the noble Lord has just said, it is sadly true that this particular scandal is part of a regrettable pattern, and I do not believe that we can yet be confident that that pattern is historic. So I welcome the prospect of a law placing a duty of candour on public servants and authorities, but I hope that that law, when it is introduced, will be as ambitious as possible, placing as much responsibility as possible on every citizen, not only those in the public sector, to be candid about failure, especially over a duty of care. Can the noble lady, the Minister, tell us if the government has considered the widest possible application of a duty of candour? Second, the issue of culture. The inquiry report identifies the need to address, and I quote, the unacceptable defensive culture prevalent across too much of the public sector. It recommends that government must be proactive in calling inquiries. Never again, it says, must campaigners have to wait for decades for an official independent investigation to take place. Yes. But as the Bishop of Sheffield, I'm bound to note that an overly defensive culture has thus far inhibited a comprehensive inquiry into events at Orgreave in 1984. If the government aspires to be proactive in calling for inquiries, I suggest there is an opportunity right there. Would the noble lady, the Minister, be prepared to comment? And thirdly, compensation. After having waited decades for justice, the infected and the affected are now in many cases still being made to wait for the full implementation of the compensation scheme. This is just wrong. When an inquiry is published as damning as this one, it is surely an overriding priority for compensation to be both generous and prompt, and we are failing in that regard right now. It is a legal maxim that justice delayed is justice denied, and it presumably follows that compensation delayed is compensation denied. Please could the noble lady, the Minister, assure the House that due compensation will be paid without significant further delay.
My Lords, I'm pleased to contribute to this debate today because while I was the MP for Worsley and Eccles South, I spoke a number of times on the issue of NHS contaminated blood, the scandal, and I was also a member of the all-party parliamentary group on contaminated blood, ably chaired by my honourable friend Dame Diana Johnson MP. And I want to acknowledge the work done by the all-party parliamentary group and by noble Lords in keeping the issues and concerns of those affected and infected by this scandal so high on the political agenda. As an MP, I represented 5 families or individuals who were affected or affected by the NHS infected blood scandal, and they were helped. I know that they were helped by knowing that both members of Parliament and noble Lords were supporting their cause. And I do want to pay tribute to the powerful speech we've heard from the noble Baroness Featherstone today. As my honourable friend Nick Thomas Simmons said in the Commons on the 2nd of September, the infected blood scandal is a shameful mark on the British state, and those who have been impacted have waited far too long to receive financial redress and true recognition of their suffering. The inquiry's report shed light on the trauma inflicted on thousands of people across the country. The voices of people who were infected and have been affected have gone unheard for far too long, which has compounded the trauma. Now, I welcome the opening comments of my noble friend the Minister, and I welcome the Labour Government's confirmation that it is the intention to deliver a comprehensive compensation scheme at the earliest possible opportunity. I understand that the Government will bring forward another set of regulations to enable compensation for affected people and to provide supplementary awards, but there is no certainty about the dates for that, and I will raise a concern about that later. I want to reflect on the cases of my former constituents and the issues they raised with me. One former constituent was a child when they were infected with hepatitis C through contaminated blood products used at the Royal Manchester Children's Hospital. The hepatitis C caused cirrhosis of the liver, and as an adult they were forced to use all of their stage 2 compensation payment of £50,000 to pay for the treatment Harvoni, which was used to treat the virus load of hepatitis C, but was not available for NHS patients, and there was uncertainty about whether it ever would become available to them. They should not have had to use their compensation to fund medical treatment for a virus they contracted while receiving NHS treatment as a child, and I hope there will be very specific redress for that. The details of the cases I had raised with me are heartbreaking. While no amount of money can compensate for the lives lost and the shattered futures, the compensation proposed now does start to represent a recognition of the scale of suffering this scandal has caused, both to the infected and the affected. I want to turn to the damage caused by the stigma surrounding the illnesses caused by contaminated blood. In his latest report, Sir Robert Francis confirms that psychosocial experts have reported that many of the impacts of this scandal have been suffered by both infected and affected people, including the distress caused to individuals and families by stigma. This is an important point, and it is the case that the gravity of the stigma experience led to social isolation for many individuals and their families. The father of a former constituent died in 1995 following treatment with infected factor VIII. But the constituent told me that she and her mother could never grieve properly for him because of the stigma surrounding HIV and AIDS at that time. In another case, Nora Worthington, mother of my former constituent Claire Dixon, was infected with HIV through a routine blood transfusion in 1982. She died of an AIDS-related illness in 1993. Claire Dixon told me that during this time, her mother endured a catalogue of soul-destroying, humiliating neglect and ultimately alienating experiences. The stigma and ignorance associated with HIV compelled Nora Worthington to protect those she loved and keep her diagnosis secret. And it's distressing to know that at this point, as Nora Worthington was a single parent, there has up to now been no payment of compensation for her daughter Claire and her brother Stephen. They have had a 31-year battle for justice for their mother. It is positive that Sir Robert Francis's report recommends that the Social Impact Award for affected persons be reconsidered with an increased figure. However, there is also concern among the affected community, and we heard about this earlier in the report, that the regulations laid by the government in August did not provide legislation for those affected, such as the bereaved family members, to receive compensation or, in fact, supplementary awards for those infected. And I understand a further SI is needed, and that will be laid in 2025 when parliamentary time allows. But I believe that this has caused uncertainty and worry, and I ask my noble friend the Minister if she can tell us what progress has been made on this second set of regulations. From this month, families will start to make applications through separate support schemes for interim payments of £100,000 for the eligible estates of those infected people who have died. Many of the estates eligible are of people who died many years ago, often several decades ago. Applicants will require legal help in obtaining probate or letters of administration or dealing with deceased executors and other legal matters. So I ask my noble friend the Minister if she can tell us whether funding for legal help will be available so that applicants are not expected to take on debt to fund their applications. As campaigners, the Dixon family have wanted to raise some extra concerns in the following points. Firstly, they point out that some living infected individuals have been excluded from existing financial support schemes. The chronic hepatitis B infected and those infected with contaminated blood stocks after the September 1991 cut-off date have never received any financial support at all. They point out that despite this being a relatively small number of people, many of them are very ill as a direct result of contaminated blood with conditions such as cirrhosis and cancer. And despite Sir Brian Langstaff's recommendations in April 2023, a typical HBV-infected individual has lost around £100,000 in financial payments from support schemes ahead of any compensation they may receive in future. The Dixons always also believe that carers are given insufficient financial recognition. They point out too that individuals with missing medical records are seriously at risk of not receiving justice from the Infected Blood Compensation Authority and having their compensation applications dismissed due to not having appropriate paperwork to prove that transfusions were given. And it has seemed to me, I should say to my noble friend the Minister, in dealing with some cases that quite a number of people are affected by this missing medical records. Also, they point out lastly that the Infected Blood Compensation Authority is not currently seen by campaigners and those infected and affected as a true arm's-length body because it's staffed by officials seconded from the Cabinet Office. I think it's important, my lords, that after so many years of being denied justice, we understand that there does remain a lack of trust in government. The perception that it's now civil servants being tasked with designing the regulations and administering, assisting, operating and supervising the compensation schemes does not help with that. and I believe that there should be the fullest consultation with those infected and affected to overcome those perceptions. My Lords, people infected and affected by contaminated blood have been through enough. It's imperative that the route to receiving compensation is both as simple and as sympathetic as possible. The payment of compensation to victims must be a recognition of the suffering of those people infected and affected by contaminated blood, which has been a shameful chapter for our NHS.
Yeah.
My Lords, this is a matter almost too awful to contemplate, but I do most heartily welcome the remarks of the noble lady, the Minister, as she started this debate. And also I'd like to pay tribute to the exceptional work of Sir Brian Langstaff and his staff. We all share that. My Lords, this is not a party political matter. All of us share responsibility. The NHS is the envy of the world. It's been said so often you can hear those words still ringing around this old chamber. But it hasn't been true for a very long time. The system of care and compassion which we created with such hope has gone horribly wrong. More than wrong, much worse than that. There have been systemic, collective and individual failures to deal ethically, appropriately and quickly with this infected blood scandal. Terrible words taken directly from Sir Brian's report. Yet the main point I think I want to make, and it follows very much in the remarks of the very pointed speech that the noble Lord Richard made, is that although this particular scandal is a national humiliation, it is far from unique. It's not just infected blood, it's the Post Office Horizon scandal, 25 years, still going strong, the Hillsborough Stadium disaster, the Rotherham grooming scandal, it's more than 3 decades and it's still not finished, the Mull of Kintyre aviation disaster, which took nearly 20 years for that truth to be revealed, and the Grenfell Tower calamity, and as we were just hearing earlier before this debate, the Afghan resettlement problem. There have been so many occasions where the public has been betrayed by its public servants. Why does this happen? Sometimes it is through direct dishonesty, but more often perhaps, well, because it's all a little uncomfortable what we're dealing with, because it would rock the boat, because it's easier to leave the squidgy bits locked in the bottom drawer, because we are the envy of the world and we know best. It's the arrogance of the untouchables. The system operates on a self-serving motto. Hold your nose, tick a box, job done, move on, quickly, and leave it all to someone else to clear up. These disasters, the infected blood, the Horizon, Hillsborough and all the rest, they were not accidents. Sir Brian makes that abundantly clear, and his conclusions are chilling. To paraphrase him, ordinary people, families, children, put their faith in the government, in the system, a system that was supposed to keep them safe, and we failed them. My Lords, the priority of our public service system is no longer to serve the public. It has become its priority to serve the system itself. This is an awful conclusion to reach, but on the basis of the evidence, it's a conclusion that seems to me to be unavoidable. The noble lady, the Minister herself, said that it's a mark of shame on everyone concerned. And I'd like to expand on the point that the noble Baroness Lady Featherstone made in her extremely powerful speech.
So may I ask the Noble Lord the Minister, after all this time and all the suffering, how many people, how many public servants have been disciplined or demoted or dismissed for their part in this tragedy of infected blood? And if the answer is none, or for some reason even after 50 years the system is somehow unable to bring up and come forward with any figures, then that seems to me to be just another example of the system winning again. I have no doubt that the government's fulsome apology is genuine, as was the fulsome apology given by the previous government. And there's compensation. Yes, justice requires compensation. Of course it does. But, my lords, even compensation won't be enough if we don't learn from this tragedy and stop these scandals happening again. So how do we make public servants properly responsible? Not just for the sins of commission, but for the sins also of omission. The grotesque lack of candour and honesty that Sir Brian has highlighted. He suggests, as we've heard, that we should pass into law a duty of accountability and candour, and I'm delighted that the Prime Minister and repeated by the Noble Lady the Minister today, has said that the government intends to pick up this challenge. So may I ask her a second question. When will this proposal see the light of day? When will we get a bill? I noticed that the Noble Lord Richard suggested that it would be in April. I hope that it will be brought forward as a matter of urgency. Why do we need to wait until April for something which has been with us for so long? It is complicated, of course, that I understand, but it is enormously, enormously important. Otherwise, all our hand-wringing will have gone to waste and all the wrongs will be repeated and the suffering of little children will go on. This government, this new government, has an opportunity to put this terrible experience not just behind us, that really isn't the point, but to put it to use, to repair and rebuild what was once our great British establishment and that relationship between the state and the individual. The headlines will be all about compensation, and rightly so, but if we leave it just at that, we ourselves will be in danger of simply ticking a box and moving on. The real change we need will require not just compensation, but courage. The courage to take on all the many vested interests that any legislation will encounter, and to see the job through. The government say that they will act to ensure that this kind of behaviour will never happen again. And in that objective, at least, I wish them well.
My Lords, I think every speaker in this debate has paid enormous credit to the comprehensive and important report from Sir Brian Langstaff, so much weight in there, in both a literal and a metaphorical sense. But I particularly want to focus on paying extreme credit and respect to the individuals, both the infected and the affected, who provided the heart of the testimony to Sir Brian's report. They were people who were talking about the most awful personal experiences, and they were crucial to Sir Brian's work, and I think it's really important that we focus on their contribution. Now, I want to thank the Noble Lady Baroness Twikos for securing this debate, for the very clear introduction and the tone which the government has adopted in this space, as indeed the previous government did. And this has been, I think, a very powerful debate. But I particularly want to pick up a word used by the Noble Lord Bitchard, complacency. And I think, in following on from the Noble Lord Dobbs, I think we have to ask the question about where the complacency has lain, where the responsibility for the complacency has lain. The Noble Lord Dobbs said, make public servants responsible, make officials, talked about the civil service. But I think we have to ask about where does the leadership come from? ultimately there is political responsibility. That's where responsibility is supposed to lie in our system. And I'm afraid I'm going to say something that may feel uncomfortable to many sides of your Lordship's House. The next time you feel tempted to use the phrase world leading in a self-congratulatory tone, please ask yourself the question, is this justified, and are we using this as an excuse not to be better? Because that is very often what it comes across. And if that is the message that's being delivered from the political leadership down to the people who are, after all, in your hands as a political leader when you're the minister, what is it going to be directing them to do? Please do ask these questions. And when people come to you and say everything's fine, but at the same time there are campaigners, there are people who are saying we've been mistreated, the state is not working here, it hasn't delivered for us. Please don't just take a reassurance from a civil service, from a Quango, from whoever, to say, no, it's fine. Please keep asking questions. Now, I think I'm not going to go through people in this debate are very, very aware, your Lordship's House is very aware, but I think Sir Brian Langstaff highlighted some absolutely wrong things that happened. The intentional destruction of documents, the decision by the government to use phrases such as no conclusive proof of a link between blood products and HIV, to give false comfort and to misrepresent risks. And I think if there's one sentence from Sir Brian's report that really needs to be highlighted, it's that sentence that says, this disaster was not an accident. So let's look at the fact that the World Health Organization advice from the 1950s warned of the risks as well as ways to minimize them, like heat treating blood and restricting those who could donate. Now, a great deal's already been said, so I won't go over the same ground about the duty of candour and the so-called Hillsborough Law Report. But I will stress that I'm confident your Lordship's House will absolutely be focusing on the detail of that bill and what we might be able to do to make it stronger, and I look forward to doing that. And I again pick up the words of the Noble Lord Bishard about the need for civic involvement, public involvement, true democracy in terms of making sure that Hillsborough law is as strong as it can possibly be. Now, I think both the Noble Ladies, Featherstone and Keeley, have talked about the delays to the compensation for the affected as opposed to the infected. I'm just going to make a couple of additional points rather than going over the same ground. I'm particularly drawing here on the briefing from the campaign group Factor 8. And I'm looking at the applications for interim payments of 100,000 estates for the eligible £100,000 payments for the eligible estates of those who've died. And a specific question to the Noble Lady the Minister, will the funding for legal help be available in advance to families that may be applying for that funding? Because for them to have to self-fund and then claim the money later is obviously for many going to be utterly impossible. Now, I think we've covered a huge amount of ground in what has really truly been a harrowing debate. So I'm really just going to make two final points. One of which is many references have been made, and I'll particularly pick up the point made by the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Sheffield, the Orgreave inquiry. Where is it? And I repeat that question to the Noble Lady the Minister. But I think when we're thinking about the compensation we're talking about today, we have to think about the Windrush scandal and the second scandal of how Windrush compensation has simply not worked out, and we have to think about that in this context. And I don't think anyone has yet mentioned, but I think the parallel has to be drawn with the issues raised in the so-called Cumberledge report, the First Do No Harm report, vaginal mesh, sodium valproate and Primodos, which are significantly in terms of time after the events we're talking about in terms of the infected blood scandal, but the same things kept happening again and again and again, and we have to highlight that. And I also want to highlight, not in the medical field, but on the 21st of October, I'll be joining the Truth About Zane campaign, referring to the terrible death of the 7-year-old Zane Bangbola, who was killed by a flooding that released toxic chemicals from a historic landfill site. And there were total failures in government action after that. And I very much hope that we're going to hear positive news from the government of keeping up with Sir Keir Starmer's previous promise to hold an independent inquiry into Zane's death. There are so many issues here, and I circle back really to where I started. We have individual failures, we have structural failures, but we also have to ask the question, let's not just blame the way things are structured, let's ask the question of why do we not have a state that functions for its people? Because we don't. And that means we should be asking some very deep questions about the way this place, the other place, the whole of the British government is structured.
My Lords, I too wish to recognise, of course, the tenacity and bravery of the many victims and their families who've suffered grievously due to receiving medical care that did them harm, contrary to the very first principles of medical ethics. This was then compounded by the failure of many parts of the state to respond to their concerns and the concealment of what then happened to them. I was incredibly moved by the noble lady, Lady Featherstone's bravery in speaking in this debate about her own family's circumstances. I served recently on the Select Committee of your Lordship's House on the Inquiries Act, which called its recent report Public Inquiries Enhancing Public Trust. This public inquiry, chaired by Sir Brian Langstaff of 6 years, 2 interim reports and the separate work on the compensation scheme by Sir Robert Francis Casey, cannot be subject to the criticism too long or too costly. It has enhanced public trust in this system, that somewhere between the political and the justice systems lies public inquiries. When all else fails, it's a public inquiry we need. But it took too long to get there, a point to which I will return. Whilst noble lords will have the opportunity to debate fully the Select Committee's report, some of our conclusions are relevant or overlap with the inquiry's work. But keeping first things first, namely ensuring swift compensation to those infected and affected by infected blood and blood products and families of the deceased. I do hope the noble lady, the Minister, can confirm that the application system for those interim payments of £100,000 for families of the deceased has actually opened this month, as was outlined as the intention in the other place by the Paymaster General in July and September of this year. Also, along with the noble lady, Lady Keeley, I do join with the question of when the second set of statutory instruments will be laid, dealing with compensation more fully for those affected. It's important that Parliament considers that. Whilst I repeat that the main focus should be compensation at this stage, I do hope the noble lady, the Minister, is able to provide details of the progress with the many other recommendations that Sir Brian put forward, as she noted they're having careful consideration. As the Select Committee on Public Inquiries heard so many times, even if His Majesty's Government accepts a public inquiry's recommendations, whether they are then enacted upon is another matter, and it can be remarkably hard to find out what progress is being made on each particular recommendation. As this inquiry recommended that the evidence and the report should remain accessible to the public, will this be the place where there will be a simple timetable and progress that is accessible to the public? This public inquiry has admirably built confidence with victims and their families, so enacting accepted recommendations is vital to retain that trust. Both this public inquiry and the Select Committee's report recommends some kind of role for Parliament in holding the government to account on that progress in implementing recommendations they have accepted. Sir Brian envisages this role to be that of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee of the House of Commons, and the Select Committee of your Lordship's House a new joint Select Committee. In the other place, the Paymaster General did not seem entirely clear on accepting that there will be some role for Parliament to play in the future. So could the Noble Lady, the Minister, please confirm that in principle Parliament will have some kind of role? Time, human energy and money has been well spent here, but will His Majesty's Government be held to how they'll be held to account on the recommendations is not clear. Please let's not ask more of these victims and their families in that regard. So, if a good public inquiry like this is the answer when all else is failing, how do we get here quicker? As the Right Reverend Prelate said, justice delayed is justice denied, but it also compounds enormously the personal trauma. Noble Lords who served with me on the Select Committee will not be surprised to hear me mention how affected I was by the evidence of Bill Wright, the co-chair of Haemophilia Scotland. The Scottish Parliament was first asked in 1999 for a public inquiry, and it took a quarter of a century until the infected blood inquiry reported. Mr. Wright also said, some of the people coming into inquiries will be completely broken, some will be highly resilient. It is obvious that for victims to have to go through such lengthy campaigns as the Noble Lady, Lady Featherstone outlined, to get an inquiry compounds the damage and breaks some of them, if the original harm has not already done so. Again, Sir Brian and the Select Committee see a role here for Parliament, and I'd be grateful if the Noble Lady could outline what His Majesty's Government view is of this. I'm aware that the Noble Lady may have to write to me, but when there are so many public inquiries now happening, it seems highly unusual that Parliament has not yet got a more formal role. Although it is another matter that might need a letter, there are a number of recommendations that are more constitutional in nature, a specialism again of your Lordship's House. Recommendations such as ending the defensive culture in the civil service and government, a statutory duty of accountability for senior civil servants on candour and completeness of advice to permanent secretaries and ministers, and again the government should consider the extent to which ministers should be subject to a duty beyond their current duty to Parliament under the Ministerial Code. I know the Noble Lord Bishard commented on this, but whilst there might just ordinarily be, this might ordinarily be a matter for the recommendations for the Cabinet Secretary and maybe the Minister for the Cabinet Office, but such conclusions by Sir Brian in such a landmark report on such wide-scale failure of the state call, I believe, for more in-depth consideration. The Select Committee was often told of the culture of candour in the aviation industry, where apparently mistakes are reported and people are not cowed by fear of the consequences for their own employment. How have they achieved that culture? I hope to see a humble attitude from His Majesty's Government in seeking advice from other industries, perhaps also from the Institute for Government, who are one of the few bodies that can talk to ministers whilst in office, and maybe the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Does everyone, from junior officials to even Secretaries of State, know where they can discreetly obtain confidential ethics advice when something just doesn't feel right, but everyone seems to think it's okay? I recall my time as a barrister from very early on. The induction is you have a phone number to get hold of a King's Counsel at short notice, confidentially, if you have an ethics concern in the heat of a trial that you need advice on. Why are ministers not also so equipped? And I note that this is particularly important for ministers and special advisors due to the nature of their appointment and the nature of how they can be dismissed. It seems to me are outside of any of the protections of the whistleblowers legislation. Finally, can the Noble Lady the Minister confirm, just for the record, that public servants for the duty of candour legislation will include ministers of the Crown? Finally, my Lords, returning to the first thing, the first priority, that's compensation. We also heard so much in Select Committee that lessons are not learned as to how to hold, when a public inquiry has been held, those lessons are not passed on to the next public inquiry. So I do hope that all the expertise of Sir Robert Francis is not lost. But I do hope, along with all noble lords, that we'll never have to use his expertise again.
My lords, it is good to hear the compassionate remarks of the noble Lady Berridge. And I thank the noble Lady, the Minister, for her committed and comprehensive speech and wish her well in the ministerial life ahead. My lords, I should declare that I answered a questionnaire concerning the inquiry. My lords, I recollect a mother. She was dignified and clearly worried. It was a weekly constituency surgery, just one of 50 a year for those 31 Commons years. We were in the Working Men's Club in the tired, long-gone Great Western Railway community. It's a great barn of a place. Warm sunlight was lighting up the dancing dust particles above the wooden floor that creaked as my constituent advanced towards my table. My sons, it's my sons, both of them. It's horrible. My sons need help. Those were her first urgent whispered words. My boys are in danger. It is a tragedy. It's both of them. It's so unfair. They are haemophiliacs, and both of them are. This woman was bespectacled and had gone to the trouble of wearing her costume best. She was twisting her handkerchief, which was brightly embroidered, and I detected a slight waft of her fragrance, and her breathing had become tight, and her blue eyes behind the glass were heavily moistened. This was an ordeal for her, and I had to be more than sympathetic. They need blood. They need good blood. Now they've been given poisoned blood. No, it's contaminated blood. These dreadful words were jerked out in between troubled breaths. Her interview was an ordeal, a torment, and I felt greatly disadvantaged by her whispered passion. One's duty was to be receptive always, but this was so personal. And when the interviewer is engulfed by a fellow citizen's deep feeling, one wants to give more than polite attention. Was I capable of reassuring this emblematic supercharged motherhood? This stressed woman of quality was twisting her handkerchief this way and that as she poured out her worries and her scorn for the failed blood intruded into her son's veins. They were not young, they were at risk, they had always had it rough, and now this. It was more than she could bear. Well, it's axiomatic that the constituent wants, above all, to tell of her feelings. It is not a rendered rational statement to the Member of Parliament. It is an expression of feeling, the consequences of pent-up frustration. It calls for priestly empathy, for listening skills, for sincerity. And it was called for from a person so often recently travelled from the snake pit of Westminster, nerves a-jangling, often frequently sleepless. Well, this mother's monumental concern deserved better from me, an inadequate practitioner. Well, I did my level best, and surely I radiated courtesy, respect, support, and understanding. But could it ever be enough? What could I do in the positive sense? Did my constituent leave as a satisfied visitor? Could anything avenge her anger, her despair, and her frustration? I doubt it. But I had the grace to escort her to the door, to shake her hand and promise my efforts. And some 40 years later, there would be an inquiry of the utmost integrity, open and caringly chaired by Sir Brian Langstaff, and compensation. But how do you compensate for her grief, for her anger, for her son's distress? Well, Sir Robert Francis's KC shows skills that Newton and Hooke might have admired, and I hope things go well in terms of compensation. But my lords, my constituents' sons were the victims of a disgraceful dereliction of duty. Highly placed, extravagantly paid elite bureaucrats had failed to remain vigilant and exacting. Risks were taken, corners were cut, fellow human beings, innocents, suffered dreadful damage. And it was instructive for me to hear the speech of the noble Lord Bishop. Surely we will not advance to abolish your lordship's noble house. There are always contributions to be made. Well, no amount of Westminster do-goodery could make the ideal reversal of a fateful decision. No Commons questions, no parliamentary debate, no petitions, no remonstrations to those committed ministers could right this dreadful wrong. The miseries continues in those wrecked lives. The guilty were hiding. And why was it so long before this inquiry took place? It was a salutary interview for a do-gooding member, and I never saw that marvellous mother again.
My Lords, I thank Lady Twycross for introducing this debate today and colleagues from across the House for their contributions. I particularly want to thank Lady Featherstone for her family's experience and Lady Keeley and Lord Jones for their constituents' experience, which was profound. My own experience was that almost 50 years ago this year, I took a drama group to Lord Mayor Trelaw's school and met a number of the boys with haemophilia as well as the other students at the school. Somewhat terrified me when they helped us to cook our meal and were parading very large knives when we were cutting things up, knowing they were haemophiliacs, and we joked about it. But they lived their lives normally because that was how Trelaw's worked. What none of us knew at the time was that these were the same boys who were invisibly and unknown to their families being used for research purposes. And that is an absolute disgrace. I want to thank the victims, whether infected or affected, the victims' groups, including some who've been mentioned already today, Factor 8, the haemophilia societies from across the United Kingdom, Tainted Blood, and many others who have been let down time and time again. From our experience over the last few years, we know that they really hoped that with the publication of the final report, governments past and current would do the right thing. So on the 20th of May, when Sir Brian Langstaff published his final report, 2 interim reports in previous years, 7 volumes, those of us who have read it over the summer may have incurred the wrath of families for the box of books going away with us. But my lords, we needed to read it. We needed to read all of it because it is something that must never be repeated. Sir Brian, almost alone amongst other people that the victims have come into contact with over half a century, gained the confidence of the victims, not least because he promised he would produce a report that understood and respected their position. This report is exceptional. It joins up failures by past governments of all colours in other scandals and tragedies. It understands how the NHS failed vulnerable patients time and again, and it lays a clear route map for ministers, Whitehall, Parliament and those in the health sector to begin to remedy this. The 20th of May was a very moving day. All of us at the launch of the report thought there was a new beginning. But my lords, as we've been hearing this afternoon, there are already concerns and problems. And frankly, my lords, even scheduling the debate that was promised in July has been difficult, planned for September and changed to today. Lady Bennett said we should think carefully about using the phrase world leading, and she's right. Because the lessons to be learned, and I'm going to quote now from the inquiry, are starkly obvious to anyone who has read the rest of the report. But few people in training for a career in medicine may take that opportunity. A very real danger is that the lessons of the past are forgotten when fresh history is being made in the years to come, and only then, after another disaster, remembered. And I too thought of Lady Cumberledge's excellent report, First Do No Harm, which repeated many of the same points, lessons still not learned. And the aviation example that Lady Bennett made is really important because we don't have that culture of no fault. It's always about how do we protect those who may have made mistakes. It's interesting that Lord Dobbs talked about this being an NHS problem. It wasn't just an NHS problem. Compensation has been paid in Australia, Canada, China, France, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Portugal and the USA. But not always from a government. In the USA, it was the pharma companies who had to pay. What's wrong about the UK is that we are almost the last. It took us years to get to that point. The duty of candour has been discussed much so far this afternoon, and leadership in the NHS. Duty of candour was introduced in the NHS in 2014, and to Lord Bishard I say it's very broad and about everyday practice, both professional and statutory, and it defines what are notifiable safety incidents. And yet, do we yet have a duty of candour working in the NHS? My answer is no. The Mid-Staffs Hospital scandal, the growing maternity scandals across the country, the vaginal mesh, the whistleblower treated very badly, who on that one was shunned by her profession until the details came out. This is still a live problem. And the report talks about the defensive culture of the civil service and how that must be changed too. And I think that that is the problem that Lord Lansley and other ministers faced. So it is good that the government is going to tackle this. But what will success look like? Curiosity of ministers? Civil servants able to start with, you may not like to hear this, Minister, but I think there's an even more daring thing we should expect. It could and should be the uncovering of other scandals. Patient safety is absolutely vital. Monitoring liver damage in those with Hep C, as well as those suffering from transfusions. So it is good to hear of the government's prioritisation of the Patient Safety Commissioner. But I say to the Minister something I've said to health ministers in recent months. Are there enough resources for the Patient Safety Commissioner to be able to do their job properly? They need it. It must be funded properly. And on transfusions, you would think that we have learned lessons as more and more have been revealed over the years with this inquiry and with serious cases. But the majority, that is over 80% of reports to the serious hazards of transfusion scheme, known as SHOT, are now due to errors or mistakes in the clinical transfusion process. And Professor Toe, the chair of the National Blood Transfusion Committee, writing in the BMJ, said, the number of deaths related to blood transfusions has more than doubled since the COVID-19 pandemic, and the serious hazards of transfusion group reports that these numbers have not returned to pre-pandemic levels, remaining at or above 35 deaths per annum since 2020. This is deeply concerning, he says, but not entirely surprising in an overstretched NHS, yet immediate and sustainable improvements are achievable. My Lords, Sir Brian says that there must also be funding to find the undiagnosed, anyone who had a blood transfusion before 1996 but has not yet been investigated. My Lords, I realise with some horror today, I'm one of those. I had a blood transfusion during having my second child. How will the government communicate to the public that they need to get that blood test done? Sir Robert Francis' proposals for compensation were only published on the 26th of July this year. Says the scheme is open to new applicants until the 1st of April next year. Yet, as the government now says, further regulations covering the affected and the supplementary routes will only be published when parliamentary time allows. So in May, I raised the problems of an individual whose claim was made over 5 years ago, but because the NHS has lost part of their medical records, they're stuck. They said at the time, how can we fight a machine that's protecting itself? So what will the government do, not just for those as yet undiagnosed, but those stuck in the system because their medical records are not complete? The inquiry talks about protecting haemophilia care, and it's good that there are peer reviews, but an important recommendation is that they should happen not less than once in every 5 years, and that NHS trusts and boards should be required to deliberate on those findings on peer reviews. That's key to changing the culture, because having a duty of candour won't work until we have that change in culture. Sir Brian points out that patients must be given a voice. He says they need to be enabled and empowered. But as others have said, and I agree, talking to victims, whether infected or affected by this scandal, the lack of a voice even today is shocking. His 5 recommendations in this area are all sensible. So can the Minister say if they are all accepted, and if they are, when they will be implemented? And this includes support and funding for patient advocacy, UK Haemophilia Society, Hepatitis C Trust, Haemophilia Scotland, Haemophilia Northern Ireland, the UK Thalassemia Society and the Sickle Cell Society. Many noble lords have raised the issue about why and when a public inquiry was so late. Sir Brian said by 1986 the government could have been under no illusion about the scale of what had happened to people with haemophilia. Many had been infected with HIV. Sufferers of HIV experienced a public hostility and stigma. And in addition, over the 5 years that followed, it became apparent beyond question that non-A and non-B hep, with which most had also been infected, was far more serious than some clinicians would have wished to believe in the early 1980s. End quote. My Lords, that is 38 years ago. Many other calls for public inquiries have also taken a long time to gather pace before ministers and the Whitehall machine had to give in. And Lord Bishard spoke of deliberately blocking and how the Nolan principles was substantially absent. And that is Sir Brian's key point. This isn't just about infected blood, it's about the Post Office Horizon scandal, the Grenfell Tower fire, the Hillsborough tragedy, the thalidomide scandal, Windrush, vaginal mesh, sodium valproate. Did we not learn from thalidomide? No, and many more. Lady Bennet called out what went wrong. Lord Lansley mentioned Lord Reid saying in 2008 that this was a moral issue, not one where fault should be apportioned. And Sir Brian notes that Lord Fowler, who was Secretary of State and Social Services prior to 1987, had urged that it took far too long for this inquiry to be held and had not been afraid to criticise its prevarication. And Lord Owen, who retired from your Lordship's house in August this year, declared very early on when a minister that the UK must become independent in supplying blood for transfusion. Shame that was not heeded and that was dropped when he ceased to be a minister. As many other members of your Lordship's House have said, over all colours of government, I look forward As have many others of members of your Lordship's House over all colours of government have noted that there has been too much slowness and too much prevarication. On the issue of public inquiries, I look forward to the debate that your Lordship's House is going to have on the report of the Select Committee on Public Inquiries Enhancing Public Trust, because it is right to note this is all about public trust. It's important to note the issues relating to the redress scheme arising out of these inquiries. Sir Robert Francis and his team were working alongside Sir Brian's, and his report, Sir Robert's report, was published in March 2022 and Sir Brian's second interim report in April 2023. And Earl Howe and I have had many debates about this interim report over the last year. With one or two minor technical exceptions, they agreed with each other, and Sir Brian said that interim payments, both infected and affected, should be made by December last year, not least because the complexity of awards would inevitably mean some delays. But no one was paid by Sir Brian's deadline. In fact, the legislation making it possible was only concluded on the same day that the general election was called, and that was in a great rush, but we did do it. The regulations were published in the depths of August this year, and whilst I am grateful to the Paymaster General for calling me to let me know this was happening, 2 months later, this is the first opportunity we've had to discuss them. Next week, we're scheduled to have a regret motion, which I have put in, on those regulations. And I'm glad I have, because so many noble lords this afternoon have raised concerns with the redress scheme. So I look forward to hearing their contributions on Monday if they're around. I'm really concerned, my lords, about the affected and supported routes. This is the first bit of official bad faith since the 20th of May announcement, both from the tail end of the previous government and from the new government. All parties before the general election, including then ministers and new ministers, agreed it was urgent and supported Sir Brian's urging that infected and affected should be treated equally. Unfortunately, this is not the case, and the regulations that we are doing on Monday only cover the infected victims, leaving out other key areas, with further questions even on some of the infected ones. Some of the widows and other victims are being told the next regs will only be published when there is parliamentary time allows to discuss it. Unlike the regulations that we're discussing next week, this government has now created a two-tier system, they say. And that is causing real distress. It has destroyed much of the trust that was built up till the 20th of May. So can I press the noble lady, the Minister, to say when we will see the second regulations, which Sir Brian reminded us are as urgent as the first, which we are debating next week?
My Lords, before this debate began, I reflected that we were about to experience one of those rare occasions in this House in which neither party politics nor personal disagreements would rear their heads even for an instant, and so indeed it has proved. I would like to begin by following the lead of every speaker this afternoon in saying that we cannot approach this most grave of topics other than with a sense of deep shame and humility, alongside a willingness to open our minds, to listen and to learn. And that is surely the only attitude possible for parliamentarians as we digest the findings of this magisterial report by Sir Brian Langstaff, a report in which the full agony of this seemingly never-ending story of failure and deceit is rolled out before us like a blood-stained carpet. Painful as his message is to us all, to government, clinicians, regulators, civil servants, the NHS hierarchy, Sir Brian has done the nation a signal service, and it behoves us to thank him now for the qualities that he brought to his task, his thoroughness, his clarity of thought, and his transparent humanity, all of which have given encouragement and hope where none for years seemed possible to the infected blood community. The overriding purpose of Sir Brian's report, as he makes clear, was threefold: to expose what happened and why, to describe how authorities reacted to what had happened and why they did so, and importantly, to articulate the lessons to be learnt from those findings and the recommendations that should follow from them. I'm sure we all believe that Sir Brian has amply fulfilled his mission. However, for that very reason, we cannot hope to do justice today to the wide range of his findings, still less to the vast quantity of evidence given by the many, many individuals who came forward to tell their stories, often with enormous courage, although the noble Baroness Lady Featherstone has given us a vivid flavour of it. So the first and perhaps the most important thing I wish to say is that we should regard today not as the culmination of a process, but rather as the start of one. There are imperatives arising from Sir Brian's recommendations that require swift action, as noble lords have said, the most obvious being the need to deliver compensation expeditiously to the people infected and affected by this disaster, on a scale that properly reflects the degree of harm and suffering inflicted on them. Sir Brian, I have to say, with good reason, criticises the pace at which appropriate arrangements have been put in place. Now that they have been, it is up to us to exercise oversight to make sure that the process of delivery is effective, efficient, and perhaps above all, sensitively handled. But that objective, important as it is one for the relatively short term. If one looks at the rest of Sir Brian's recommendations, there is one feature that stands out a mile, which is that to achieve what must be the ultimate aim of this inquiry, namely to create a better future, there is an enormous amount of work to be done by a large number of people in the NHS, in the civil service, by ministers across government, and by Parliament. And the reason for that, of course, is the need to change a culture, or I should say cultures. For we all know that any serious endeavour in that vein, if it is to be truly successful, is bound not only to take time, but also to require constant renewal and reinvigoration over the years. Although, as we know, Sir Brian lays much of the responsibility for the infected blood disaster at the door of successive governments, in his summing up, he addresses a number of audiences. The first of these is the medical profession and those responsible for codifying and imparting good clinical practice. My lords, I'm quite sure that the Royal Colleges, the GMC and NHS England, in their respective roles, will have already picked up the clear messages in the report that are aimed at them. However, I hope the Minister will agree that this is one set of circumstances where the government cannot be totally hands-off when it comes to clinical practice and standards. The noble Lord Darcy, in his recent very valuable report on the state of the NHS, closely echoes Sir Brian Langstaff in stressing the need for a health service that is both safe and patient-centred. And that is an aim that requires a certain mindset on the part of clinical staff, one in which safety and listening to patients are paramount considerations. Unfortunately, in some care settings, that mindset is in somewhat short supply. One of Lord Darcy's more depressing findings was that amid the many pockets of good and outstanding practice to be found in the NHS, there is also widespread evidence of disengagement, low morale, and what he calls a reduction of discretionary effort amongst clinical staff, things that together can only serve to frustrate the good objectives that he espouses. Lord Darcy plainly sees them as objectives which are unlikely to be attainable without a very clear plan for climbing the hill in front of us, not just on the part of the NHS and the professions, but also on the part of government as to what regulatory structures and what statutory measures are needed to support and underpin those efforts. In other words, this has to be a concerted endeavour that involves collective, open-minded thinking by all relevant bodies. I want to pick up the issue of regulation very briefly. The Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman is quoted as saying that there are now too many regulators in the health service. In fact, a lot of people are now saying that. Professor Charles Vincent and others, in an article published in the BMJ 5 years ago, made trenchant comments to that effect. Sir Brian's view, surely right, is that the regulatory system needs to be easy for ordinary people to navigate, which it isn't. Nor is it at all joined up. Sometimes effort is poorly directed. I must confess to a personal view that too much of the CQC's focus nowadays is on inputs and not enough on outcomes, both good and bad. In matters of clinical safety, structures and culture are linked. Simplifying structures and redefining accountabilities are ideas crying out to be looked at. The Patient Safety Commissioner, whose appointment we owe to my noble friend, Lady Cumberledge, has spoken alarmingly of, quote, a culture that is getting worse. She added that, again quoting, unless leaders set out a strategic intention to listen and act, we are heading straight back to the days of mid-staffs and other health scandals. My lords, let those words serve as a warning. And it isn't just the health service that needs to look carefully at its culture. Sir Brian's frank exposure of the failings, the defensiveness, and the downright deceit that have characterised the behaviour of parts of the civil service is absolutely chilling. At various stages of the Victims and Prisoners Bill earlier this year, we debated the merits of applying a legal duty of candour to those working in all branches of the public service. My view on that hasn't changed. I'm not in principle against a duty of candour. I simply think that on its own it will be ineffective. It was the coalition government that brought in a duty of candour for health service bodies in the wake of the mid-staffs scandal. I was a member of that government, and I wish I could say that the duty had had a measurable effect. Without somehow banishing the knee-jerk defensiveness that persists within some healthcare providers, and without providers being genuinely willing to listen to the concerns of patients, a standalone duty of candour is simply not going to cut the mustard, either in the NHS or mutatis mutandis elsewhere. How then to make it effective? Sir Brian believes that the missing link revolves around leadership, such that health service leaders are made directly accountable in law for the culture that they oversee. Well, at first blush, that seems to me a pretty stiff duty to put into anyone's job contract. But coming from Sir Brian, the idea must be one that we treat with due seriousness. When it comes to the civil service, it's noteworthy that Sir Brian doesn't go so far as to insist that the civil service code should be pensioned off. However, he does say that the duty of candour implicit in the civil service code needs to have teeth if civil servants are not tempted to revert to what one witness, Dame Una O'Brien, described as a culture of hierarchy and dismissiveness. Again, her belief is that it is leadership within a government department that is the key to bringing about the desired opposite, which is a culture of trust and respect. As with the health service, Sir Brian's recommendation is for there to be a legal duty of accountability on senior civil servants for the candour and completeness of advice given to ministers. Again, I can't help thinking that so long as hierarchies exist, and for as long as civil servants are afraid of speaking out, let us say, about a senior colleague, Dame Una's aspiration may remain just that. But we must be open-minded to ideas of this kind. The gravity of the events that have unfolded over the past half a century is reason enough for us to do so. The Minister has indicated that the recommendations contained in the Infected Blood Inquiry report will receive the closest attention from the government over the weeks and months ahead. That is good, but I should like her, if she can, to go a bit further. Many of us have observed that reports from statutory public inquiries have a tendency to disappear behind a civil service veil after a certain lapse of time, unless there is a parliamentary mechanism to keep them squarely in the public view. In this particular instance, the sheer multitude of recommendations, I haven't counted them, but they are an enormous number, multitude of recommendations bearing in great detail upon so many bodies, organisations and individuals, surely requires a mechanism to be put in place whereby Parliament can be reassured of the progress being made in taking the recommendations forward across the piece. In the first instance, it was helpful to hear the Minister commit to reporting back to Parliament, as Sir Brian suggested, before the end of this year on how they intend to proceed in this regard. However, without imposing a duty of candour on the government, I wouldn't be so impertinent as to do that. I would like to think that we can expect from ministers a willingness to use this House and the other place, including a suitable common select committee or perhaps a joint committee, as a means of sharing and debating actions and ideas in a spirit of openness. For surely, my lords, this kind of non-partisan honesty and openness is the least that we owe to those thousands of people whom our country has so cruelly betrayed.
I'd like to thank Noble Lords for the hugely important points that have been raised in this debate. If I don't cover questions that you've raised, I'll endeavour to write with further details and put the letter in the library. I think hearing your Lordship's contributions today is really a stark reminder of the enormity of the scandal and the utterly shocking truths that the inquiry brought to life. I'm clear, as the Noble Lord Earl Howe alluded to, that there is consensus across your Lordship's House, both on the extent of the failure, the need to ensure redress as far as redress is ever possible, and to make that through the compensation scheme as quickly as possible, and that apologies are absolutely worth nothing without action to ensure that nothing like this can happen again, which is easily said but has proved almost impossible over many years to deliver. And we must do this, as the Noble Lord Earl Howe said, with humility. A number of Noble Lords mentioned the delay to the inquiry taking place, and it clearly did take too long. I wanted to note the role of the Noble Lady Baroness May in calling the inquiry, without which we wouldn't be having the report we have and are debating today. The personal testimony of many of your Lordships, including the Noble Lady Baroness Featherstone, reflects the many tragic stories told in the inquiry's report, as did the description of my noble friend Lord Jones of his discussions and contact with his constituents' sons, which I found quite distressing, as well as the Noble Lady Baroness Boynton's description of her own engagement with the children at Trelaw School. I'm clear that no amount of money could possibly compensate those both infected or affected. I'm not going to repeat the Noble Lord Earl Howe's points on Lord Darcy's review, apart from to thank him for seeing the relevance of the review to what the report outlines, not least in how we need to remedy the faults in the health system. It's clear that the government response to so many of the failures described in the report, including the emerging threat of AIDS in blood and blood products, should have been faster and it should have been better. Today, while no medical treatment can be completely risk-free, current safety standards for blood donation and transfusion are rigorous, and England's blood supply is one of the safest in the world. Throughout the blood donation journey, there are now processes in place to ensure the safety of blood and blood products. These include the donation safety check form, testing for specific infections, donor deferrals, regulations, informed consents. I noted with concern the Noble Lady Baroness Brinton's points on blood transfusions, and will write to her on the points she raised and place a copy in the library. In response to the Noble Lady's points on finding the undiagnosed, GP services have introduced a new case finding question for patients registering with a new practice to locate people who received a blood transfusion prior to 1996. In response to the Noble Lady's point on the resources available for the Patient Safety Commissioner in order to do their job properly, we have today published the terms of reference for review by Dr. Penny Dash that will look at the patient safety landscape. This review will cover the Office of the Patient Safety Commissioner along with other organisations and will help us to understand what is required to have effective national leadership on patient safety. In response to Baroness Featherstone's point in relation to the moral obligation to compensate victims, a failure to deliver compensation for those infected and affected by the infected blood scandal would, I agree, be a moral failure and not one that this government intends to commit. Regarding the level of funding made available to the infected blood support schemes, the government is committed to ensuring that compensation is paid swiftly, not least because the victims in the scandal have already suffered unspeakably and for far too long. Noble Lords are right to raise that prior to the setting up of the support schemes in 2017, the previous approach of providing assistance was not effective. My Lords, we can be in no doubt that everyone should all have paid more regard to the victims of this scandal and sought to establish the truth for them much earlier. The time it took for the truth to come to light is unacceptable. The Right Reverend Prelate and the Noble Lady Baroness Bennett raised the point around the Orgreave inquiry, and while it isn't the main topic of this debate, I'd like to confirm to Noble Lords that this was a manifesto commitment of the Labour Party during the election campaign, so it will happen. The Noble Lord, Lord Dobbs, referred to the countless examples of other occasions where the system becomes self-serving. I'm not sure, though, that I agree that return to a past establishment that served the public better would serve the public best, because I'm not sure that that is ever what an establishment does unless it receives the appropriate challenge required. And both the Noble Lord, Lord Bishop, and the Noble Baroness Bennett highlighted the risk of complacency. We cannot afford to be complacent. And Baroness Bennett and Baroness Brinton rightly highlighted the importance of asking questions. And in response to the Noble Lord, Lord Lansley, I have no doubt of the good intention of ministers, but the lesson I take as a new minister is the need to ask questions and the right questions at the right time. And one of the most shocking elements of the whole, one of many, was the destruction of key documents, including ministerial advice and medical records. Records of any sort should not have been destroyed. And today the Department of Health and Social Care employs robust document management procedures with all its registered files under the direct control of its Departmental Records Office. A number of noble lords, including the Noble Lord, Lord Bishop, focused on process and what needs to change as a result of the findings. He rightly noted the honesty and transparency which are already required. My Lord, we rightly say that nothing like this should ever happen again, but these words are clearly meaningless without a clear way forward. The Prime Minister's announcement that legislation on a duty of candour will be introduced by the government is one step to ensuring that change will happen. The duty will apply to public authorities and public servants and include criminal sanctions. Culture and behaviours also need to change alongside thought being given to the way inquiries function and how the findings of inquiries are addressed. I note the noble Lord's Earl Howe's reservations on the duty of candour and look forward to future discussion on how we can make sure that this might be effective, not just for the current period we're in, but for future as well. Lord Bishop and the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Sheffield, asked about what the scope of the bill would be, which is otherwise noted as the Hillsborough Bill, and what the government consider a wide application for how it will be introduced. The bill will be introduced to Parliament before the next anniversary of the Hillsborough disaster, and following the Prime Minister's announcement, the scope and policy detail of the bill continues to be worked through, and the government will provide more detail at the end of the year. The bill will set out the duties on public authorities and public servants, including any consequences for breaches, and this will include criminal offences. The noble Lord Dobbs asked how many civil servants had been disciplined and whether charges had been brought. I mean, I have to say that is for the police and for the Crown Prosecution Service, who will look at these matters very carefully, but should they take any such matters further, the government will cooperate fully, and I will ask for a question on the issue of discipline issues, which is a separate matter, and will write to the noble Lord. I welcome the noble Lady Baroness Berridge's focus on the important role of public inquiries as a measure required and used when things go wrong. So a sign that the system is working when things fail, rather than a sign of failure in itself. I found her contribution very interesting. I don't have answers to all your points. I do have some answers to some of them, but we would endeavour to write to the points I can't answer today. I know noble lords will have already noted the report the noble lady mentioned, published by the House of Lords Inquiries Committee on the 16th of September, making recommendations on the efficacy and practice of public inquiries. The government is carefully considering these recommendations, as well as recommendations from other public inquiries, and will respond in detail as soon as possible. On the question that was raised by the noble lady Baroness Berridge, and I think by a number of other lords, and apologies for not mentioning you by name, of the role of Parliament in monitoring what happens after a public inquiry. The government is looking very closely at the recommendations made by the House of Lords inquiry and will respond by the 16th of November. And I think that as somebody who myself has paid very close attention to a number of public inquiries relating to some of my previous roles, I think that for me, if we don't find a way of monitoring things carefully, we cannot give the assurance that we will prevent future harm or future recurrence of some of the issues that we've seen in the past. I welcome the noble lady's Baroness Berridge's focus on the, sorry, that's the same page. Apologies, I'll move swiftly on. I'll now turn to other points raised by noble lords. Baroness Featherstone asked whether autonomy and social impact awards we've made available for the affected. A social impact award for past and future consequences of the infection, including stigma and social isolation, will be awarded to both people who are infected or their estates and affected persons. An autonomy award addressing the distress and suffering caused by the impact of the disease, including interference with family and private lives, will be awarded to people who are infected or their estate and affected partners, parents and children. In relation to the noble lady's point on which affected persons would be eligible for compensation, affected persons will be eligible where their case is linked to that of a person with an eligible infection under the compensation scheme and is not dependent on whether the affected person had a financial dependency on the person with an infection. So this includes affected partners, children, parents and siblings and other friends and families who cared for loved ones with an infection without reward or remuneration. So far, in terms of the amount paid out so far, over £1 billion has been paid out in interim compensation payments to victims of the infected blood scandal. This month, applications will open for interim payments of £100,000 to the estates of deceased people who were registered with an infected blood support scheme or predecessor Alliance House organisation who were infected with contaminated blood or blood products and whose deaths have not yet been recognised. The Right Reverend Prelate raised concerns about the timescale for compensation, and I'm conscious that the community wants further assurance on the timelines for delivering compensation. The government does expect the Infected Blood Compensation Authority to begin making payments to people who are infected under the Infected Blood Compensation Scheme by the end of this year. Payments to the affected are expected to begin in 2025 following a second set of regulations, and concerns over delays was raised by a number of other noble lords, included by my noble friend Baroness Keeley. I understand that there is disappointment about the regulations being split out in the way that they have been, and there are important details, especially in consideration of Sir Robert Francis's recommendations, the majority of which the government has accepted, which must be worked through ahead of the second set of regulations. This includes details such as an eligibility criteria of people who are affected and an additional autonomy award for those who were the subjects of unethical testing. In answer to the noble ladies Baroness Berridge, my noble friend Baroness Keeley, and the noble lady Baroness Featherstone's point on the timing of payments to those affected, subject to parliamentary approval, the government is aiming for the second set of regulations to be in place by the 31st of March next year. This will support our intention for payments to affected people to begin in 2025. My noble friend Baroness Keeley raised the point about interim payments to estates and would there be funding for legal help in obtaining probate. The government will provide more information on the process for applying for interim payments to estates by the end of this month. We recognise the importance of legal support for applicants who need to obtain probate and will ensure that information is provided when applications open. So, my lords, I hope that the debate today and my words in summing up have offered some reassurances to noble lords, even if I haven't managed to answer all your questions. As I've said, a further update will be provided at the end of the year, but I'm very happy to meet noble lords to discuss details in the meantime. If I haven't addressed specific points, we'll make sure I go back over those when we read through Hansard. As the noble Lord Earl Howe said, this is in some sense a start of a process, not the end. It's an incredibly important topic, and I thank noble lords for the time and scrutiny they have given it today. All noble lords must be acutely aware of the responsibility we all hold to ensure we learn from the truly shocking events that were described in Sir Brian's report, and I want to assure your lordships that the government takes the report extremely seriously and will continue to work to respond to these vital recommendations.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as with that opinion will say content. Content.